Good evening and welcome once again to the Tzemach Bible Institute program. I'm John Klein, and with me tonight as usual is Ken Garrison, pastor of Fellowship Church and founder of the Tzemach Bible Institute. Good evening, Ken.
Good evening, John.
Ken, maybe you could straighten me out. If biblically Israel is the only Christian nation, so how could we hear all the time that America is a Christian nation? Is that possible?
No, John, I don't think so. We're going to address that issue tonight, looking at how the church has assimilated into nation after nation, actually, and actually assumed a national and sometimes a universal identity. But before we do that, John, an interesting thing that I've noted in the papers is recently the Pope in Rome made a statement, a declaration, which was not a new thing. He's reverting to ancient Catholic doctrine, but he declared that the Roman Catholic Church was the only true church. That Protestant churches and even Eastern Orthodox churches could not truly be considered real churches. Now, in Tuesday's Orlando Sentinel, a local pastor responded to that, wrote an opinion, and drew the obvious conclusion from that, and I'll just read his statement. You see, Pope Benedict also maintains that the only door to salvation is through the one true church. In short, he says, if you're not Catholic, you're hell-bound. And he goes on to say, what arrogance, we say, for any spiritual group to claim to have the management contract for the gate of heaven. Now, certainly I think I would tend to agree with this particular pastor in that regard, but this points out an important fallacy in Christian doctrine in general. And it's true not only of the Roman Catholic Church, but it's true of virtually all Protestant churches. The Christianity itself maintains that it has that exclusive contract or deal, John, to control the gate of heaven. If you're in the church, you're in.
If you're not in the church, you're doomed.
You're doomed. You're doomed. And just exactly what the pastor wrote concerning the Pope's position is a general position of Christianity. Several years ago, I wrote a book, and we've recently just rewrote it, edited it, and published it anew. Got some new copies, and it's called Hebraic Roots. I want to just refer you to it. And one of the chapters of that book is absolute church Christian authority and judgment, exclusive church authority and judgment. I want to invite you to call in or write in and pick up a copy of it, because it addresses the issue that both the Pope and this local pastor has addressed, and I think puts it in a biblical perspective. So I'm going to suggest that this is a very, very important issue, and it's coming to fore. Now we're going to address that issue today, looking at the identity, the national or universal identity of the Christian church, and see what really is a biblical position. That's what we want to do.
Okay, now Ken, so we hear all the time Christian America, Christian Europe, the Holy Roman Empire. So are you saying that there's really no biblical position? That somebody claiming something that they can't back up scripturally?
Well, John, I like your statement that you sometimes make, that Israel is the only Christian nation. I mean, I want to challenge you to consider, because that sounds like an absurd statement in a sense, but it's really true, because Christian means anointed,
right?
Chosen of God, elect, anointed, and
so God never rejected him, never unchosen, if I can use that terminology. In other words, the Bible is full of God's words. You are my witness, Israel. I am the Holy One of Israel.
Sure.
I'm the only God. So if you're calling something biblical and it's outside of Israel, and you're saying that's the focus of God's attention, you have weak shoes to stand in.
Well, you don't have any at all.
You don't have any at all.
It's just plain unscriptural. Now, I will say that the Roman Catholic position in this sense is at least consistent, whereas Protestant position is not, because Roman Catholic doctrine, as I understand it, that the tradition of the Church Fathers takes equal authority alongside of the Bible, and so the Church Fathers adopted that position, and so from a Catholic perspective, that makes it authoritative. Protestants, on the other hand, are the ones that I know looked at church doctrine or church teaching and discipline, maintains that the Scriptures are the only basis for our teaching. Okay. And if we maintain that the Scriptures are the only basis for teaching, then we must be grafted into Israel.
Okay, so we have the Bible written in the 1st century, and then we have the Church Fathers from 2nd to 5th or 6th century, and so it all depends who you want to take.
Sure.
All
sure.
Right. So okay. So we want.
Go ahead, John.
All right. We want to demonstrate then that the church is intended to have national roots, all right, but national roots inside of Israel. Biblically, we hope to demonstrate, or we will demonstrate, that that's the only biblical position grafted into the Commonwealth of Israel.
Yeah, I might say that I would suggest that the Pope ought to read Romans 11. It was written to his city, right. So they ought to read. Now, we want to look at the historical record for a moment and see how this problem emerged in the first place. John referred to the church fathers of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries and so on. In that period of time, the church defined itself as universal, and when I say universal, specifically as non-national or non-Israeli. There was a real pressure or movement to separate themselves from Israel. I want to read an excerpt from a Christian historian, the Christian of the History Church, by Williston Walker. I just want to read an excerpt that says, Christians looked upon themselves, now this is during the 2nd century, they looked upon themselves as a separated people, a new race, the true Israel, whose citizenship was no longer in the Roman Empire, though they prayed for its welfare and that of its rulers, but their citizenship was in the heavenly Jerusalem. And of course, this is taken out of the book of Hebrews. So that was their view. And so they were in the process of defining themselves as a universal people separate from Israel.
Okay. Now, there were things happening on the ground that helped bring this position forward. Remember, with the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. and the church scattered, and the Jewish leadership waning. That's how we see it coming on. It's a difficult time for Israel. Israel is at war, rebelling against Roman occupation, starting in 66 A.D., and then the destruction of the temple in Masada in about 73 A.D., and then a great war again from about the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 132 to about 135, when it was completely overrun and Jews were crucified en masse, and the church was looking to get away from this Israeli identity and fit into the Roman nation, Ken, because of the persecution.
Wasn't exactly a time that people were relishing in Jewish identity.
That's right. No, there was actually real persecution. So the universal church then, as opposed to the being grafted in Israel, has been passed down over the centuries to every Christian denomination. And so we have, and in fact, when Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church, he didn't challenge that at all.
Right.
So basically that position has stayed, never challenged. We're challenging it this evening on the biblical basis.
Okay. So we find then, because of all the struggle that happened in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, the church fathers defined themselves, their position separate from Israel, a replacement Israel. They were a replacement Israel, and with a non-national identity or Catholic or universal identity, that was their identity. Now, speaking of identity, I want to change the subject just for a moment to look for the need and consider the need for an identity. all of us, I believe, have a need for an identity. You know, we have an identity, our heritage, our family, the region that we are from. John obviously is a Yankee from the north. I'm from the hill country of Kentucky. Not really a southerner as such. I guess you'd call it a hillbilly or something like that, maybe, identity. And we're Americans, and so we have an identity. Family. John's from a Jewish background, and so we all need a certain dimension of identity for a sense of well-being. The clearer that identity is, a lot of people identify with schools. I see people license plates all around here. You're either a Gator fan or you're a Seminole fan or something of that nature. So we all have
that
personal
human
identity.
need to belong to something, to be a part of something,
Sure.
especially something successful. Israel wasn't successful in those days, and this need, even when you become a believer in Messiah Jesus, there's still this need for this identity, and well, it's just the human condition.
Sure.
Now, the Bible states that we have become new creatures in Messiah Jesus. All things are passed away. We have a new family, the family of believers. Very often we become very close with people that believe likewise with us. And so we have this national identity, and we have this universal identity in the church and a national identity as Americans, and it's confusing, and besides that, it's not satisfying at all because there's no real basis there, so we just push it aside and move on.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, now by the way, one of the things that we recognize is that a person like John, who comes from a Jewish background, when he becomes a believer, is not really challenged in this regard because he can have his original identity is with Israel in the first place. His family identity is with Israel. So the idea that when John became a believer in Messiah Jesus, that somehow he'd have to adapt identity was not a problem because he already had a biblical identity with Israel. Now,
it might have been a problem in certain churches where they tried to discourage that identity or preach against an identity with Israel.
Okay, I think some do that, but now someone from a Gentile background like myself, there is a crisis because I still have the same need for identity, national or whatever, and so there's a conflict with this universal identity and the need for a national identity. As a result of that conflict, the Christianity has simply seen itself as being assimilating into nation after nation throughout the centuries, and so the church has taken a national identity quite frequently, actually in conflict with this universal thing, but nevertheless they've done it. So we think of a Christian Europe or a Christian America for that matter. If we back up long enough in history, a Christian Holy Roman Empire. All of these are efforts at satisfying the need in Christians from Gentile backgrounds for a national identity. So that's something that we all need. Now we're developing we want to set forth a thesis that God recognizes that need, and for the real believer there is a biblical position for this.
Okay, so anyway, this whole concept leads to things like Christian America, and we have a marriage between the universal church and a secular nation. We see in Revelation 13 a real push towards a one world government and a one world religion, also geared from Satan to satisfy that need.
Absolutely.
And separated from Israel entirely. In fact, that's the beast that makes war with Israel.
Absolutely. So this a real warning, I would say, to any real believer is that this Catholic identity, now when I say Catholic there, I'm using a little c, this non-national, non-Israeli identity in Christianity as a whole is an absolute setup to be a part of the Antichrist system. Because in Revelation 13, what John is speaking about, there are two beasts actually that's defined there, and those are governmental systems, one secular, one religious. They're both Catholic. They're both universal. They're a global system. So we speak today of globalism. Actually, globalism is an old subject in the Catholic Church, because it is the global church. And from a biblical perspective, the very definition of the Antichrist system itself. All right, so John, we've talked about...
Okay, what is the covenant? What is the basis for the church in the first place? Well, when you get we're not going to read it tonight. We've read it other times. 2 Samuel 7, God makes a covenant with King David and talks about his son. So the Ben David, the son of David covenant, is for a house, a throne, and a kingdom. And we see that clearly identified in Luke 1 and Matthew 1 by the angel Gabriel as being Jesus. So if Jesus is the fulfillment of the Son of David covenant, his throne is in Jerusalem, and it's hard to get far from that, make that universal. Because the Bible, in fact, the angel Gabriel, right from the throne of God, says he will sit on the throne of his father David and rule over the house of Jacob forever. He has to be, in other words, you have to be grafted into Israel to become part of this with Messiah Jesus. Otherwise, you're on, here again, weak biblical grounds, Ken.
Right. Last week on this program, we talked about the very name of Christ itself, or Messiah, and set forth the position that Messiah or Christ is we might say, a political office within Israel itself. So the fact is, you cannot separate the concept of Messiah or Christ from the nation of Israel. Again, we get back to the original comment or question that Israel is indeed the only Christ or Christian or anointed nation per se.
You know, people, I don't think they separate Moses or King David or any of the prophets, but Jesus they separate from Israel. And Jesus is just the fulfillment of the king, the prophet, and the priest.
Well,
why? And he never separated himself. He said, "I came only for the house of the lost sheep of Israel."
John, I think I would differ with you just a bit on that. I've heard plenty of Christian pastors refer to Abraham and Moses and David as Christians. And very, very, very similar.
I thought only Muslims did that.
Well,
the
Muslims only did what they saw the Christians doing in that regard. They just repeated the same things. It really is strange.
It's mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling. It's unscriptural. That's the important part. Now, let's look from a biblical perspective. We're venturing forth some strong statements, but let's look in the Bible and see what it says. I indicated earlier that Protestant position especially is built on a strictly biblical foundation of authority. So let's look at what the Apostle Paul wrote. We'll start with the statement that he wrote to the Ephesians, chapter 2, and there's a very telling statement there, if you'd read that, John.
All right, we're in verse 12, and he says, and he's writing to Gentiles now. He says, "Remember that you were at that time separate from Messiah, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenant of promise, having no hope and without God in the world." If we reverse all those things that you didn't have before you believed in Jesus, why would you leave out the commonwealth of Israel, the national life of Israel? According to Paul's statement, now you should be involved with the national life of Israel. In fact, you are become Israeli in that respect.
That's an incredible statement if you think about it, because when he said the political life or the commonwealth of Israel in that particular statement, he essentially defined we who are from Gentile backgrounds, and that's who he was talking to, that we've become essentially, from God's perspective, citizens of the state of Israel. So there's no mistaking Paul's intention in this statement that we as people from Gentile background who have become believers in Messiah Jesus, our identity, our national identity should be that of Israel. We're grafted into the nation of Israel. We spoke earlier about the need for identity. Well, Christian identity should be that exactly of Israel.
Okay, so now Ken and I on previous stations have programs have both said we're both veterans and we served in the American Armed Forces, and we would recommend our sons or grandchildren or whatever, we're living here, we would defend this country. But spiritually speaking, and beyond that, we are Israeli citizens according to the scriptures.
And this is particularly true from identity. It's
Right.
really, really important from an identity standpoint, because God intended, I am absolutely convinced, and again, I've developed this thesis in the book that I recommended earlier, Hebraic Roots, that our identity should be common with Israel. Now, we don't have the same job as Israel does. The Israelis are settling the mountains of Israel, and they're developing Jewish life in the land, and that's wonderful, and we encourage that, and we have a specific role in Messiah Jesus to complement that. But our identity
Absolutely.
should be common with it.
Right.
Read for us, John, the statement that Paul made to the Church of Rome along these same lines.
Okay, now in Romans 11, which you recommended that the Pope read, listen what he says in verse 17, and he's talking about Gentiles and Israel here, and Jews here. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, meaning a Gentile, someone from a Gentile background, were grafted in among them, grafted in among the Jews, and became partakers with them of the rich root of the olive tree. Do not be arrogant towards the branches, but if you were arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but it is the root who supports you. That root is the national life, the commonwealth is the nation Israel. And it's the nation Israel that supports the church, gives it a firm foundation biblically. And you can't, think of a tree reaching down with its leaves and cutting off its roots. What would happen to that tree? It would die.
It would die. And that's exactly why Paul used that analogy, is because now I think that Paul had specific prophetic insight, because now remember, this is in the letter to the church at Rome. I think he had prophetic insight that this very church at the center of the empire would ultimately be the one that did just what you said, reach down and cut off its roots. In other words,
and it died.
In other words, to move itself into a non-national, not identifying with Israel, but seeing itself as universal or separate. And so what was Paul's prophecy to that church? If you do that, God's going to cut you off. And that's exactly what happened. And that's why the Roman Catholic Church has gone in. I just looked this week at Los Angeles. There was a I guess in the 60s and the 70s particularly, the Roman Catholic Church must have done an experimentation with homosexuals in the priesthood, and boy, they're paying the price. They've paid in the order of billions of dollars. Now listen, how far from biblical standards must you get to have active homosexuals in the priesthood?
Ministering to young boys and molesting them. And then, when it's found out, avoid prosecution and ship them out somewhere, cover it up. That's criminal activity.
I think Paul's prophecy that God will cut you off if you sever your roots with Israel has fully demonstrated in that regard.
Could that be the reason there's so many denominations? God cuts one off because they're not identifying with Israel. He starts another one, another anointing, and they do the same old thing. And so there's all these denominations out there.
Well, think about it this way, John. These churches are born in revival. Most churches are born in revival. So if a group of people come together and humble themselves and call on the name of the Lord under Jesus' authority, God pours out His blessing on them. But if they continue to think of themselves separate from Israel, then it's just a matter of a generation or so before they come totally institutionalized, and the revival dies, and all you have left is the institutional frame that results from that. So hence we have the nucleization of church after church after church, stillborn, essentially stillborn.
So everyone becomes a universal church and dies.
Well, yeah, they were born universal churches.
Okay.
Because, again, Luther never challenged that, and so the Protestant churches has never challenged that. We must be well, I'm sure we're not the only ones, or the first ones for that matter, but it's evident in today's world.
Okay. So we want to then encourage you to repent from this universal identity. It's patently unscriptural. It's not that you should favor Jews or they're better than anyone else. They're just called by God. This is the position, and we need not change it because God doesn't change. We want to encourage you to embrace a true biblical identity in national Israel because that's the only biblical position according to the Bible.
Again, as we maintain program for program, the office of Messiah or Christ it's a political office within the nation of Israel, cannot be separated from Israel. We want to make a couple of quick announcements tonight. In just a couple of weeks, on August the 5th, we're going to have Gershon Solomon, leader of the Temple Mount Faithful organization, with us. We want to invite you to come out and hear him and interact with him because he leads an important movement today, has for decades in Israel. In addition to that, Mr. Klein is going to be taking a group up in a few months to the land. Tell us something about your trip, John, that you're planning.
Well, we're going up, and we're going actually all over Israel. We're going to spend a little less than 2 weeks. And we're going to go to settlements in Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem and Hebron and the Galilee. We're just going to go up and see that good thing God's doing today. And so I'm inviting you to come with us. Give us a call. I'll send you a brochure. Well, that's our program for this evening. Shalom.